Hello everyone, and welcome to Relax for a While. I'm Joanne, and I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. If you're new to the channel, a warm welcome to you. In tonight's video, we're going to get cozy with the Maida series as we immerse ourselves in a sleepy audiobook from the second book of the series, Maida's Little House. This sleepy audiobook will help transport you to a peaceful state of mind, perfect for unwinding after a long day. We'll embark on a magical journey with a little girl named Maida and all of her friends while they spend a happy summer together in a quaint little house in the country that has everything a child could wish for. Before we begin, I recommend keeping the volume at a lower level. This will help create a calming atmosphere that can lull you into sleepiness. With the soft sounds of my voice, a lower volume will make the experience even more soothing and help you relax more deeply. So, adjust your volume to a comfortable, quiet level, settle in, and let yourself be carried away by the story. Now, go ahead and close your eyes. Take a slow, deep, comfortable breath. Hold it for a moment and exhale slowly. Feel the tension melting away from your body as you prepare to drift off into a world of wonder and imagination. And so, my friend, lay back, relax, and let the soothing narration and calming sounds lull you into a peaceful sleep. Chapter 16, Mystery. Arthur's first inclination was to call, but something within him warned him not to do that. Something just as imperative advised him to another course of action. He waited a moment or two to let Silva get far enough ahead so that she could not possibly hear his footsteps. Then he followed her. She walked with extraordinary swiftness, so swiftly indeed that Arthur was put to it to keep up with her. However, she had the advantage over him in that she knew the trail perfectly. Her feet stumbled over no obstacles, her arms hit no protruding branches, her face brushed against no scratchy twigs. She moved indeed as though it were day. Arthur was in a difficult situation. He must walk quickly to keep up with her, but if he walked too quickly, she would certainly hear him. Presently, she came to the place in the trail where it turned at right angles on itself. Arthur, anticipating this, stopped in the shadow of a tree in the far side of the path. Silva turned swiftly. It happened that she did glance indifferently backwards over the way in which she had come, but she could not have seen Arthur, for she went on at the same composed high pace. But Arthur saw that she was carrying under her arm a bottle of milk. Arthur quickened his cautious footsteps, came in his turn to the fork in the trail. There was Silva ahead, her white skirt fluttering on both sides of her vigorous walking, much as the white foam of the sea flutters away from the prow of the ship. She kept straight on, and Arthur followed. The moon dipped behind clouds and re-emerged, casting alternating light and shadow over the path. On and on they went, the stalker and the stalked. They were approaching the moraine, Big stones began to lift out of the underbrush on either side. Some were like great tables, flat and smooth. Others were protruding like huge monsters, resting on their front paws or haunches. Layers of rust-colored leaves accumulated over many years lay between them. The moonlight caught on the rocks with a black glisten and on the leaves with a red gleam as the dew was falling. Arthur began to wonder what he should do next. He assumed Silva was heading to the moraine, mainly because there seemed no other place for her to go, though he couldn't guess her purpose. If she stopped there, he would soon become visible to her. He could either retreat by the path he had come or disappear into the woods on either side. He couldn't bring himself to turn back. If he chose the second option, he would undoubtedly get lost and would have to wait for daylight to find his way home, stretching the generous liberty Mr. Westerbrook had given him. He might call out to Silva, but something inside warned him not to make his presence known. He continued to follow the vigorous figure ahead. Silva hurried faster and faster, as if approaching her destination. Arthur hurried too. Silva broke into what was almost a run, holding the bottle of milk carefully. Arthur was perplexed. Why was she speeding? What could she possibly need to do at this spot and at this hour? What required such urgent haste? Perhaps he would find out in another moment. Then, suddenly, strange things happened all at once. Silva's rapid progress, as it neared its objective, became less careful. An overhanging briar caught her hair, pulling her up sharply. In her first effort to extricate herself, she turned completely around and caught sight of Arthur a little way down the trail. She started so convulsively that even Arthur could see it. Then, with a swift wrench of her slender hand, she tore her hair free and ran like a deer towards the moraine. Arthur ran too. As he ran, he called, "Don't be afraid, Silva. It's Arthur Duncan from the little house. Don't mind me, I won't hurt you." But Silva only increased her speed. Arthur did the same. He was gaining on her quickly. He entered the moraine just as Silva was disappearing from it on the other side. "I tell you," he called, "I'm not going to hurt you. Stop, I want to speak to you." Silva did not answer. He heard her frantic floundering among the underbrush. For the noise she made, she might have been an elephant. Then suddenly, there was silence, utter and complete. Had she fainted? What could be the matter? What a silly girl to act like that. Arthur rushed across the moraine and into the woods on the other side. Silva had disappeared as completely as if she'd vanished into thin air. Arthur stared around like one waking from a dream. Then he began to search for her. He peered around rocks and into clumps of bushes. Nobody, nothing. "Silva Burrell," he called. "Silva, Silva, where are you?" And then, because he was genuinely worried, "Please answer, please, I'm afraid you're hurt." He expanded his search over a wider area. He climbed rocks, remembering how Silva could climb, and looked up into trees. He crawled on hands and knees through every little thicket he found. All the time he kept calling. Still nobody, still nothing. As far as he could see, he was absolutely alone in that part of the wood. After half an hour, he gave up. He was a little alarmed and very humiliated. He walked back over the trail to the magic mirror, his head bent in deep thought. He found the canoe, slid into it absently, and mechanically paddled himself across the water. All the while, he continued to think hard. It's like a dream, he thought. I'd think anyone else was dreaming who told me this. When he reached the barn, the whole mysterious episode seemed to float out of his mind in a great wave of drowsiness. He fell immediately into slumber, but his sleep was full of strange dreams. When he awoke in the morning, his experience of the night before threatened to blend with them. But I didn't dream the peacocks or the deer, he reassured himself. And I know I didn't dream Silva. He said nothing of his experience to any of the other children, though he found himself tempted to tell Maida, but a kind of shyness held him back. At times, he wondered if Silva might be lying injured somewhere in the woods, but always something instinctively made him believe this was not true. Halfway through the morning, Granny Flynn sent him on an errand to the village. As he came out of the post office, he ran into Silva Burl, just about to enter it. He tumbled off the wheel he had just mounted. "Say," he said, without any other greeting, "where did you disappear to last night?" "Last night?" Silva repeated in a tone of mere curiosity. "What do you mean by last night?" "You know very well what I mean," Arthur persisted. "Last night in the moraine, in the woods." "In the moraine, in the woods," Silva repeated. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't sleep in the woods last night. I slept in my tent as usual." Arthur looked at her hard. "Well," he said after a moment, "either you're telling the biggest whopper I've ever heard, or you were walking in your sleep." "Walking in my sleep?" Silva said scornfully. "You're crazy." And she passed on. Chapter 17, Crescent Moon Beach. It was drawing near the middle of August, and now with each sunrise, the fun at the little house seemed to double itself. "I never saw such a place as this," Rosie wailed once. "There aren't hours enough to do all the things you want to do every day, and not days enough to do all you want to do every week." There was some justice in Rosie's complaint. The day's program of swimming, tennis, croquet, bicycling, reading, and games had been broken into by the coming of the berry season. Blueberries and blackberries were thick in the vicinity, and the children enjoyed enormously eating the fruit they had gathered. Floribel taught the little girls how to make blueberry cake and blackberry grunt, and on their teacher's day out, the little house was sure to have one of these delicacies for luncheon and another for dinner. The big six tried to do everything, of course, and as Laura complained, they succeeded in doing everything badly and no one thing very well. One day, Maida appeared at the table with a radiant look of one who has spawned an idea. "Granny," she said, "we haven't had a picnic on the beach yet. Every summer we go to the beach once at least. Can't we go this week on Floribel's day out? We girls will cook the luncheon and pack it all up nicely." "But the beach is pretty far away," Mrs. Dorr said warily. "How far is it? Could you walk to it?" "It's between 4 and 5 miles, Maida answered hazily. "You see, the little children could go in the motor, and the rest of us, the big six, could go on our bicycles." "But I don't think," Mrs. Dorr said, "that I'd like you children to go so far away without a grown person with you." "Yes, of course," Maida said. "You and Granny come too." But with Zeke and Florabelle away, Mrs. Dorr protested, who would drive the automobile? Maida's face fell. Oh, she exclaimed, I never thought of that. All the faces about the table, they had grown bright in anticipation of this new excursion, grew dark. Zeke had already taught Arthur and Harold to run the machine, but Mr. Westerbrook's orders against unlicensed persons driving it were strict. For a moment, it looked as though the ocean picnic must be given up. I think, Maida faltered, if I asked my father to lend us bodkins and the big car, he'd do it. Mrs. Dorr shook her head. I wouldn't like you to have to do that, Maida, she said. Your father has given us everything that he thinks necessary for this household. She added gratefully, and more than any of us had ever had in our lives before. I should certainly not like you to ask a single thing more of him. Again, gloom descended on the Big Six, and then hope showed her bright face again. I'll tell you what I'll do, Florabelle, who was waiting on table, broke in. Zeke and I've wanted for a long time to see the big ocean. Now, if you let the little children go do a picnic, Mrs. Dorr, Zeke and I will go with them and take the best care of them. Oh, would you, Florabelle? Rosie asked. Well, in that case, Mrs. Dorr decided thoughtfully, I don't see why you shouldn't all go. Madness at once broke out in both Sixes, little and big. Laura, Maida, and Rosie leaped to their feet and danced about the room. The little children beat on the table with their spoons, and the three boys indulged in ear-splitting whistles. The next Thursday, Florabelle, Zeke, the little Six, and the lunch packed somehow into the machine. The Big Six on their bicycles, streaming ahead like couriers, started off for the beach. Thank goodness we've remembered the salt this time, Rosie said to Arthur as they mounted their wheels. I took care of that myself. It was a beautiful day, cool as it was sunny, brisk as it was warm. The winding road led through South Scituate and then over a long stretch of scrub pine country straight to the beach. Just as they emerged from the Westerbrook estate into South Scituate, Maida's bicycle made a sudden swerve. Why, I just saw Sylvia Burrell, she called in a whisper to Rosie. She was walking along the trail towards the little house. I wonder what she's doing there. Well, you may be very sure she isn't calling on us, Rosie declared. And if she is, I'm delighted to think that Granny will say, not at home. Still, Maida said thoughtfully, that trail leads directly to the little house. She must be going there for some reason. Probably, Laura remarked scornfully. She's hoping she'll meet some of us, so she can make faces at us. The automobile arrived at the beach first, and the cyclists came straggling in one after another. Crescent Moon Beach was like a deeply cut silver crescent, furred at each tip of the crescent with a tight grove of scrub pines, which grew down to the very water's edge. Beyond it, except for a single island, stretched unbroken the vast heaving blue of the Atlantic. Under the lee of the southern tip of the crescent was a line of half a dozen bathhouses. What a wonderful, wonderful beach, Laura commented. And there's that island, Dickie said. How I wish I could swim out to it. I have never been on an island in my life. Could you swim as far as that, Arthur? Arthur laughed. I should say not. Nobody but a professional could do that. And perhaps he'd find it some pull. It's much longer than it looks, Dickie. Distances on the water are very deceiving. What's on the island, Maida? Dickie went on curiously. Have you ever been there? Oh, yes, Maida answered. Once. I went on Father's yacht, but I was such a little girl that I have only one impression, of great trees and enormous rocks and thick underbrush. Dickie sighed. I wish we could go on a picnic there. What's that over there? Harold demanded, pointing to a spot far out where a series of poles, connected by webs of fishnet, rose above the water's surface. Oh, that's a fish weir, Maida declared electrically. I'd forgotten all about that. You see, the tide's going out. It goes out almost 2 miles here, and if we follow it up, we can get into the weir and come back before the tide overtakes us. Maida explained the situation to Floribel. Floribel turned to Zeke for advice. Zeke corroborated Maida's story. He had, he said, been in the weir several times himself. Floribel said she would stay on the beach with the little six, while Zeke accompanied the big six. When they came back, she added, lunch would be all spread out on the beach. The last bathhouse, Maida informed them, is ours. Now let's get into our bathing suits at once because we have no time to lose. It was only partially low tide when they arrived, but it almost seemed to the children that they could see the water slipping away towards the horizon. When they emerged from the bathhouse, a patch of eelgrass, not far off, made a brilliant green spot in the midst of the golden sand. As the big six started towards the fish weir, the little six were splashing about in the warm shallows near shore. Oh, what fun this is, Rosie said. I love saltwater bathing more than fresh water. I don't know why, but somehow I always feel so much gayer. The salt water seemed to have an effect of gaiety on all of them. They chattered incessantly when they were not laughing or singing. At times they came to hollows between the sandbars where the water was waist-high, but in the main the water came no farther than their knees, and it continued to recede steadily before them. Sandbar after sandbar bared itself to the light of the sun, stretched before them in ridges of solid gold. Eelgrass, patch after patch, lifted above the water, spread around them areas of brilliant green. Above, white clouds and blue ether wove a radiant sky ceiling, and between, the gulls swooped and soared, circled and dashed, emitting their strange creaking cries. It seemed an hour at least to the big six before they reached the weir, but in fact it had taken little more than half that time. Zeke found the entrance to the weir and they followed him in. Here the water was waist deep. Zeke explained the plan of the weir. It was, he pointed out, nothing but a deep-sea trap for fish. The fish entered through the narrow opening into a channel which led into the big inner maze. Although it was very easy for them to float in, it was a very difficult matter finding the way out. Caught there, as the tide retreated, they stayed until the fisherman arrived with his cart and shoveled them shamefully into it. Oh, oh, Laura shrieked suddenly. This place is full of fish. One just passed me. Oh, there's another, and another. But by this time, both the girls were jumping and screaming with their excitement, for fish were darting about them everywhere. The boys, not at all nervous of course, and very much excited, were trying to drive the fish into corners to find out what they were. Zeke identified them easily enough. Cod, sculpins, flounders, and perch. "What's that big thing?" Arthur exclaimed suddenly. "Jiminy crickets!" he called excitedly. "It's the biggest turtle I ever laid my eyes on." The girls shrieked and stayed exactly where they were, clinging together, but the males all ran in Arthur's direction. "That's some turtle," commented Zeke. "I'm going to take it home," Arthur declared, "and put it in the magic mirror." "The magic mirror?" Laura echoed. "Why, I would never dare go in swimming if I knew that huge thing was there." "We'll keep it tied up with a rope," Arthur went on excitedly, It can't get where we're going swimming because the rope won't be long enough. Come on, fellows, help me get it." "How are you going to catch it?" Harold demanded. "Lasso it," Arthur declared, untying a stout rope which hung from one end of their weir posts. The prospect of catching such big game was too tempting for the males of the party, and so while the girls dashed madly about, trying to get out of their reach, screaming with excitement and holding on to each other for protection, but really enjoying the situation very much, the boys chased the turtle from corner to corner until finally Arthur managed to lasso a leathery paw and tie it captive to a weir post. How he did this, he himself found it hard to say, because the water was lashed to a miniature fury by the flounderings of both the turtle and its captors. It was probably pure accident, he was humble enough to assert, but having caught the creature, they were not content until they had brought him ashore, and so the procession started beachwards, Arthur pulling the turtle at the end of the rope. It was a huge turtle, at least 2 feet in diameter. It had wide, leathery flappers, a wicked-looking head as big, Rosie said, as her alarm clock, but its shell was beautifully marked. As they approached the beach, they could see the great square of the tablecloth laid out on the sand, and Floribel busy piling up sandwiches and hard-boiled eggs, fruit and cake. The little 6 came running to meet them, and then it became a problem to keep them out of the way of the turtle's snapping jaws. They had no difficulty, however, with Floribel, who screamed with terror at the sight of the strange creature and would not allow them to bring it on to the beach. They ended by mooring it by means of a large rock in one of the pools near the shore. Then, forgetting their prey for a while, they sat down to lunch. They were ready to do full justice to it. "Lordy," Floribel exclaimed once, "there's sure enough here for an army. Who put all that salt in the basket?" The 3 girls burst into giggles. "I was sure we'd forget the salt," Maida said, "that I put in a pair of salt cellars." "I put in 3, declared Rosie. "And I put in 4, confessed Laura. After lunch, following the orders which Mrs. Dorr had given them, they sat on the beach for an hour before they went in bathing again. This prolonged itself much more than an hour, because they began making the inevitable collections of shells and stones to take home. Floribel said the moonstones were sometimes found on this beach, and there instantly began a frantic search for the small, translucent white stones. Of course, everybody found several of what he supposed were invaluable gems. By this time, the tide, which had turned just as they left the fish weir, was now galloping up on the beach in great waves. They had to pull the turtle farther and farther inshore. At length, they all went in bathing again, the big 6 driving through the waves and occasionally getting boiled, which was a local term for being whirled about, for their pains. Floribel permitted the little 6 to play only in the rush of the waves after they broke. After 5 o'clock, blissfully tired, excitedly happy, they piled the little children into the machine, packed the turtle in the big lunch hamper, tied the cover securely over him, and started home. Wild with excitement and the news of their find, they dashed into the little house. "Oh, Granny, you'll never guess what we brought home with us," Maida exclaimed. "And oh, what a wonderful day we've had," Rosie added. "And how tired we are and how hungry," Laura concluded. The little children were all chattering with excitement. The boys were attending to the turtle in the barn. "I'm glad you've had a good time, children," Granny said gravely. "Your father's here, Maida, and he wants to see you all in the living room." Something seemed to have gone out of the gaiety of the day. What it was, or what made it go, or where it went, Maida could not guess. Perhaps it was a quality in Granny's air and words. At any rate, she said instantly, "I'm going right in there, Granny. And Rosie, will you please tell the boys to come at once?" Rosie, too, had caught an infection of this seriousness. She sped to the barn. In 3 minutes, the big six had gathered in the living room. Mr. Westerbrook was sitting on the couch in front of the fire. "Good afternoon, children," he said quietly. "I told Granny to ask you to come here the instant you came home, because I had something to say to you. It occurred to me today that I would come over to the little house when you didn't expect me and make an inspection. Hitherto, I have come regularly every Sunday. This is Thursday. I'm glad I did, because I found that neither the flower garden nor the vegetable garden had been weeded for the last 3 days. The barn was in very disorderly confusion. I asked Granny how the girls had left their rooms, and although she didn't want to tell me, she had to say that beds were not made and apparently nothing had been done. But the worst thing of all that I have to say is that I find that the tennis court is all kicked up, as though it had been played on after a shower without having first been rolled." There was an instant of silence in the room, a silence so great that everybody could hear quite plainly the ticking of the grandfather's clock. Arthur spoke first. "Mr. Westerbrook," he said in a low voice, "we ought to be ashamed of ourselves, and I certainly am, after all your kindness to us. I won't try to make any excuses because there are no excuses we can make." "It's all my fault," Harold admitted. "I'm supposed to run the boys' end of the work, and I have not held them up to keeping everything right." "It isn't your fault," Dickie declared hotly. "No more than mine or Arthur's. We're all to blame." "I'm awfully ashamed of myself, Mr. Westerbrook," Rosie confessed almost in a whisper. "I wouldn't blame you if you never forgave us, but I hope you will." "I don't know how we got this way," Laura said in perplexity. "We began right." "We've been having such a good time," Maida explained in a grave tone, "that we've just let ourselves get careless." "Then," Mr. Westerbrook advised them, rising, "try not to let yourselves get careless again." He shook hands all around and kissed his daughter. "Fair warning," he said. "I don't know when I'm coming again, but it won't be when you expect me." It was a very subdued and a very tired little trio of girls who went upstairs and attended to their rooms. It was an even more subdued, though a less tired, trio of boys who put the barn in order, and then, trailing the turtle at the end of his rope, walked down to the magic mirror and tied him to a tree and deposited him in the water there for the night. Chapter 18, Expiation. A very quiet group of children gathered at breakfast the next morning. Conversation was intermittent and devoted mainly to piling offers of assistance in the housework on Granny and Mrs. Dorr. "When you have finished your own work, we'll see," Mrs. Dorr steadily answered all these suggestions. The children finished their work in record time and with the utmost care. The girls swept and dusted their chambers. They washed the furniture, the paint, and the windows. Everything was taken out of closets and bureau drawers, shaken and carefully put back. They shook rugs. The boys, in a frenzy of emulation, followed a program equally detailed. Having accomplished all this, the big six again begged for more work, and Granny and Mrs. Dorr, taking pity on the penitent little sinners, thought up all kinds of odd jobs for them to perform. At length, Maida said, "Now we've done all the work we can do. There's one other thing I'd like to see attended to." I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know what woke me, but I began at once to think of that turtle, that poor, horrid turtle, and it suddenly came into my head that it was a very cruel thing to put a creature in fresh water who was accustomed to salt water. I suppose it'll kill him in time, won't it? She appealed to Arthur. Gee, Willikins, Arthur answered. I never thought of that. Of course he'll die. But what are we going to do about it? I thought, Maida began very falteringly, if you let us, Granny, we'd ask Zeke to drive us over to the beach, and we'd take the turtle and put him back in the water where he came from. We won't stay there but a moment. I don't see why you shouldn't do that, Mrs. Dorr accorded them thoughtfully. And as for me, I'll be glad to be well rid of that creature, Granny said shudderingly. So it was settled. After luncheon, the 3 boys went down to the magic mirror, hauled the poor awkward beast out of the water, pulled it along the trail to the barn. They loaded it into the lunch hamper again, stowed it in the automobile, and then Zeke drove them to the beach. Once there, they lifted the hamper out of the machine, removed the cover, and dumped its living contents onto the sand. There was no question as to the turtle's wishes in this matter. Without an instant's hesitation, he turned in the direction of the ocean and lumbered toward it over the sand. Lumbered awkwardly, but with a surprising swiftness. The waves were piling in, like great ridges of melted glass, green-edged with shining opalescent filigree. The turtle struck the broken wave, swam into it, dove through the next wave, and the next, and the next. Suddenly, they lost sight of him. When they returned, still unnaturally quiet, to the little house, to their great surprise, Billy Potter came forward to meet them. Their subdued spirits took an involuntary jump. Nevertheless, they greeted their guest in an unusually quiet way. Billy's perceptions, always keen, apparently leaped in an instant of calculation to the truth. After a while, in which he devoted himself to the little 6, he suggested that the big 6 take a walk with him. They accepted the invitation and plunged into the woods. When they were out of sight of the little house, "Now, what's the matter?" Billy Potter suddenly demanded. They told him, all at once, each interrupting the other, piling on excuses and explanations, interrupted with confessions and self-accusals. "We feel that we've treated Mr. Westerbrook rottenly," Arthur concluded, "and we don't know what to do to show him we're sorry," Rosie, after a pause, added. "That's pretty bad," Billy commented. "Now let's think of some way out of this." He himself meditated for an interval, falling into a study so deep that no one of the children dared interrupt it. "I'll tell you," he burst out after a while. "Why not invite Mr. Westbrook down for an afternoon, to make an inspection of the house, and to stay for supper? You probably haven't shown him for a long time how well you can cook." "No, we haven't," Maida said. "I think Father has eaten only one meal that we girls cooked." "I think that would be lovely," Rosie agreed. "Let's do it as quickly as possible," Arthur suggested. "This is Friday morning. Why don't you invite him for Monday night?" The children caught the suggestion at once. That night, working together, for Billy Potter stayed over only one train, they painfully drafted a formal invitation to Mr. Westerbrook to spend Monday afternoon with them and stay to supper. They posted it the next morning, and almost by return mail, they received a formal acceptance. Monday was a day of the most frantic work that the little house had ever seen. Everything was swept that could be swept, dusted that could be dusted, washed that could be washed, polished that could be polished. Rosie even washed off the stepping stones that led to the little house, and Maida, not to be outdone, shined the brass knocker on the door and the knob. Laura was only stopped in time from pinning flypaper, which she had bought with her own pocket money, on the outside of the screen door. "There are no flies in the house," Mrs. Dorr protested, "and we can't catch all the flies in the outside world." The boys cleaned the barn, the little cellar to the house, its tiny garret. They rolled and re-rolled the tennis court. They begged for other work, and Mrs. Dorr gave them all the table silver to polish and some pots, obstinately black to scrape. When Mr. Westabrook came, the place looked, as he said, as though they had cleaned the outside with manicure tools and the inside with the aid of a microscope. The supper, which, in deference to Mr. Westabrook, included a single hot dish, consisted of one of Rosie's delicious chowders, one of Maida's delicious blueberry cakes, one of Laura's delicious salads, and a freezer full of the boys' delicious ice cream. Mr. Westabrook said that he had eaten meals all over the United States and in nearly every country in Europe, and he could not recall any one that he enjoyed more than this. That night, the Big Six went to bed with clear consciences. Chapter 19, Maida's Mood. "What are you so quiet about, Maida?" Dickie asked at breakfast a few mornings later. "I don't think you've said a word since you've got up." "Haven't I?" Maida replied, but she added nothing. At first, because of the noise which prevailed at breakfast in the little house, nobody noticed Maida's continued silence. Then finally, Rosie Brine made comment on it. Sleepyhead, she teased. "Wake up and talk. You're not in bed asleep. You're sitting at the table." Maida opened her lips to speak, but closed them quickly on something which it was apparent she even repented thinking. She shut her lips firmly and maintained her silence. "Sleepyhead, the little mimic Delia prattled. "Wait up and tot. Not in bed asleep, sitting at table." Everybody laughed. Everybody always laughed at Delia's strenuous efforts to produce as copious a stream of conversation as the grown-ups. But Maida only bit her lips. The talk drifted among the older children to plans for the day. "Perhaps you will give us your views, Miss Westabrook," Laura said after some discussion, with a touch of purely friendly sarcasm. "That is, if you will condescend to talk with us." "Oh, can't I be quiet once in a while?" Maida exclaimed pettishly, "without everybody speaking of it?" She rose from the table. "I'm tired of talking." She walked quickly out of the dining room and ran upstairs to her own chamber. The children stared for a moment, petrified. "Why, I never saw Maida cross before," Rosie said in almost an awed tone. "I wonder what can be the matter. I hope I didn't say anything." "No, of course you didn't," Arthur answered. "Maida got out of the wrong side of her bed this morning, that's all." "Well," Laura concluded generously, "if anybody's got a right to be cross once in a while, it's Maida. She's always so sweet." After breakfast, the children separated, as was the custom of the little house, to the early morning tasks. But Rosie and Laura lingered about, talking in low tones, before one went to the library and the other into the living room to do her daily stint of dusting. After this work was finished, they proceeded to the garden and plucked flowers together. It was phlox season, and Laura cut great bunches of blossoms that ran all the shades from white to a deep magenta through pink, vermilion, lavender, and purple blue. "Oh, how lovely they look," Laura exclaimed, burying her face in the delicately perfumed mass of phlox. She put her harvest on a rock, and helped Rosie with the more difficult work of gathering nasturtiums. The vines and plants were now full of blossoms. It was impossible to keep ahead of them. They picked all they could. "I hope Maida isn't sick," Laura said after a while. "I don't believe she is," Rosie reassured her. "I wonder if we ought not to go up to her room," Laura mused. "Let's." Rosie reflected. "No, I think we better wait until after we've come back from the errands. Maida wants to be alone so seldom that I guess we'd better not interrupt her. Besides, I heard her slam her door hard and then lock it. I guess that means she doesn't want anybody around for a time." "I guess it does too," Laura agreed. "It isn't my turn to go to market, but I'm going with you this morning, Rosie. It'll give Maida a chance to be alone for a while." The little girls trundled their bicycles out of the barn, mounted them, and speeded down the long trail which led to the road. In the meantime, Maida still remained in her room. She made her bed with fierce, determined motions, as though it were work of destruction rather than construction. She dusted her bureau with swift, slapping strokes. Then she sat down by the window. Why was she cross? She didn't know, but undoubtedly she was cross. She didn't want to go anywhere. She didn't want to play games, to see anybody, least of all to talk. Why, when ordinarily she was so sociable, she should have this feeling, she had no idea. Nevertheless, it was there. From various directions, sound of voices came to her. Rosie's and Laura's from the garden, the boys from the barn, the little children from House Rock. Rosie and Laura were nearer, but she could not hear what they were saying, and of course she made no attempt to listen. Later, she heard them go round to the barn. She knew they were off on the morning marketing. Still, Maida continued to sit listlessly, looking out of the window. A long time seemed to go by. Presently, she heard in the distance the sound of Laura and Rosie returning. They were evidently in a great state of excitement. She could hear them chattering about something as they came up the trail to the house. She did not feel like talking, but she knew it was her duty to meet them, to apologize for her rudeness, to go on with the usual games of the day. She caught the rattle with which the two girls put their bicycles in place, then their swift rush to the kitchen. At the door, she got in Rosie's high, excited tones. "Where's Maida, Granny?" "Still upstairs," Granny answered. "I haven't heard her stir." "We've got something to tell her," Rosie went on swiftly. "And the most dreadful thing has happened," Laura put in simultaneously. Then, talking together in phrases that broke one against the other or overlapped, "A dreadful accident. Silva Burrell. This morning. She was on her bicycle. Man just learning to run an automobile. Knocked her off. Picked up senseless. It happened in front of Fosdick House. Took her in. There now." "How is the poor child?" Maida heard Granny ask compassionately. "Nothing broken," Laura answered eagerly, "but it was a long time before she came to." "She's not unconscious any longer," Rosie concluded the story. "She's asleep, but she moans and mutters all the time." Maida listened horrified. She felt that she ought to go downstairs and talk with the girls. She felt that she ought to get on her bicycle, go at once to see Silva. Apparently, Mrs. Dorr said something to that effect, for Rosie answered promptly, "Oh, no, nobody's allowed to see her yet." Somehow, if she could not go to Silva, Maida did not feel like talking. Not yet, at any rate. Why not get away from the house until her strange mood passed? Chapter 20, Maida's Find. Maida crept slowly out of her room, stole softly down the stairs, ran quietly to a side entrance, opened the screen door gently, closed it inaudibly, dashed down the trail to the magic mirror. She arrived at the boathouse panting, but she did not wait to recover her breath. Quickly, she unlocked the door and pulled out one of the canoes, leaped into it so swiftly that she almost upset it, paddled as rapidly as she could towards the center of the lake. It was an unusually hot day, and paddling was hot work. The water looked tempting. Maida battled with temptation, which she had never known before, to jump overboard just as she was in her fresh, clean dress and take a long swim. But she knew that Granny Flynn would disapprove of this, and she relinquished her project with a tired sigh. She did not stop paddling until she reached the other side of the lake. Then she drew the canoe in close to the shore, under an overhanging tree, lay down in it, and stared vacantly up at the sky. I know what's the matter with me, she thought suddenly. I'm tired. I didn't sleep well last night. I had a dreadful dream. Now what was that dream? It was a nightmare, really, and it seemed to last so long. What was it? Oh, what was it? She groped in her memory in the way one does to remember a haunting but elusive dream. It was like trying in pitch darkness to pick out one rag from scores of others in a rag bag. Then suddenly a ray of light seemed to pierce that darkness, and she put her hand on the right rag. Very late, long after midnight indeed, it seemed to her that somebody came into her room, that she half waked, spoke, that somebody did not answer, and she fell asleep again. Yes, she remembered now that somebody seemed to come in through the window. She fell asleep, and yet not entirely asleep. That somebody moved about the room, looked at everything. That somebody stopped near the little haircloth trunk which contained Lucy's clothes. After a while, that somebody went away through the window. But all night long, a sense of trouble and disturbance kept bringing Maida out of deep sleep to ruffled wakefulness, then sent her back into a heavy and fatiguing slumber. Thinking this over and staring up at the blue sky, Maida drifted off to sleep. She woke. It must have been nearly 2 hours later, perfectly refreshed, but she did not go back immediately to the little house. Instead, the sight of a columbine in the woods made her determined to land. She knew that Rosie particularly loved the columbines, and pursuing half-absently the trail which went to the moraine, she soon gathered a great armful. Maida became so absorbed in this pleasant duty of reparation that she went further than she intended. In fact, it was with a real sense of surprise and a slight tingle of terror that suddenly she found herself at the approach to the moraine itself. She had not been there since the extraordinary day of the picnic, and although she had not let her mind dwell on the curious experience of that occasion, she had by no means forgotten it. For a moment, she hesitated about going further, and then she caught a glimpse across the rust-brown pine-needle-covered expanse of a great clump of columbines faintly nodding their delicate heads. Involuntarily, Maida dashed across the moraine and picked them. More appeared beyond. She picked all these, and then just beyond, she caught sight of a tiny field of columbines. Maida moved in their direction, plumped herself down in the midst of their beautiful living carpet. It was cool there and quiet. The pines held the sun out, although their needles were all filmed with iridescence, but they let little glimpses of the sky through their branches. Some strange wood insect burst into a long, strident buzz. Suddenly, there came, as though from the very ground under her feet, a long, wailing cry. Maida turned white. Her heart leaped so high that she felt with another such impulse it would break through her chest. She jumped to her feet, still clutching her flowers, raced across the moraine into the path. She had not gone very far before something stopped her. Not an obstacle, but a thought. She had expected, remembering the day of the picnic, that the voice would be joined by two others. This did not happen. That first voice maintained its eerie call. The thought was, that cry is not the cry of anything frightening like a goblin or a wild animal or a tramp. It is the wail of a baby. Maida stood for a moment just where she had stopped. The cry began again. Terror surged through Maida, but she clenched her hands and made herself listen. Yes, that was what it was, the wail of a baby. Could it be some little baby animal crying for its mother? A fawn like Betsy's, or, and here Maida's hair rose on her head again, a baby bear? Her common sense immediately rejected this theory. There were no bears in the woods, and if it were a baby deer, she would be ashamed of being afraid of a baby deer when Betsy showed no fear. For another interval, she stood still fighting her cowardice. Then suddenly, she took her resolution in hand. "I'm going to find out what it is," she said aloud. Perhaps she was assisted in this by the cessation of the mysterious wail. Only for a moment, however. Her resolution received another weakening blow by the sudden resumption of the uncanny noise. But she did not actually stop, she only faltered. For the farther she walked across the moraine, the more it sounded like the crying of, not a baby animal, but a regular baby. Suddenly, all Maida's fear vanished forever. "I'm not afraid any more," she said to herself, and she wasn't. The hard thing was to discover where the cry came from. It seemed under her feet. She plunged here, there, beyond, everywhere, looking up and down, but finding nothing. Then she began a more systematic search. Starting with the very edge of the moraine, she took every rock as it came along, searching around and over it. Each clump of bushes, parted them and walked through them. Still, the cry kept up. Occasionally, she stopped to listen. "That baby's sick," she said once, and later, "I do believe it's hungry." Ahead, a big rock thrust out of the earth like an elephant sitting on its haunches. At one side, two bushes grew at so acute an angle and with branches so thickly leaved that the great surface of the rock was concealed. Maida parted them. Underneath, there was no rocky surface. The bushes concealed a small, low opening to what looked like a cave. Was it a cave? Where did it lead? How far? And again Maida's heart spun with terror. Would she confront an enraged mother bear if she entered it? But these questions all died in Maida's mind, for emerging undisputedly from the cave came the fretful cry of a baby. Without further question, Maida dropped her hands and knees and crawled into the opening. Crawled down, rather, for the entrance sloped at first. Then it began to grow level. The crying grew louder. It was a big cave. The end was lost in shadow, but in the light from the entrance, Maida could see something lying not far off on a heap of bedclothes. As she looked, a tiny hand came up and waved in the air. Maida could not stand upright yet, but she hurried over to that tiny hand. She was beginning to get the glimmer of a little white face. It was a baby. The baby put up its hands to her. Maida lifted it from the ground and made rapidly backwards to the cave opening. It was a lovely baby, Maida decided that at once. A girl, getting towards a year old, brown complexioned, with a thick shock of dark hair and big brown eyes. For a moment, it looked at Maida in surprise and even in baby distrust. Then it began to cry. Its open mouth displayed 4 little white teeth. Maida put the baby down on the soft grass in the shade of some bushes. She returned to the cave. She found a candle there, some matches in an iron box. She lighted the candle. There was one pile of baby clothes, unironed though perfectly clean, but in tatters. Beside them was another pile. Somehow these seemed familiar. Maida looked closely. They were Lucy's clothes. Then lightnings poured through Maida's mind. It was not a dream. Somebody had come into her room, robbed her, robbed little Lucy. But she must not think of that now, with a crying, perhaps a starving baby on her hands. Further back was a bundle of hay, pressed down as though somebody older slept there. There was a little alcohol lamp and the materials for warming milk bottles, but no milk. Maida returned to the baby, who had resumed its crying, took it into her lap, rocked it. What should she do? The baby must belong to somebody. But where was that somebody? It was hungry now. She felt sure of that. It seemed to her that she ought to take the baby home. And yet suppose the parent should come back. Then she would be in the position of stealing a baby. What should she do? She could not go off and leave it, nor could she stay indefinitely. She had not even told them at the little house where she was going. They would be worried about her. They would think that, like Betsy, she was lost. Pretty soon they might send out searching parties. How she regretted her pettishness of the morning. And still, if it had not been for that, she would not have come here, would not have found the baby. What should she do? She put her hands over her eyes, as though shutting out the sight of things made it easier to think. Perhaps it did, for suddenly it came to her that the first thing to consider was the baby. Babies must not be neglected. Babies must be fed. It was a serious matter for them to go too long without their milk. Suddenly, she pulled her little red morocco diary from her pocket, tore out a page. With the little pencil that lay in the loop of the diary, she wrote, "I have taken your baby to my home, the little house. It is at the end of the trail across the lake. I was afraid you had deserted her, and she would get sick and die. I am sorry if you are worried, but you can have your baby at once by claiming her." A phrase slipped from she knew not where into her mind. She concluded with it, "and proving property." She signed her own name and under it wrote, "Daughter of Jerome Westabrook." Her mind made up, Maida worked quickly. Holding the baby in her arms, she walked swiftly down the trail to the canoe. Here a problem presented itself. She could not hold the baby in her arms, nor could she let the hot sun of that hot August day pour on the little head. After a great deal of difficulty and some maneuvering, she managed to stand up some thickly leaved branches so that they made a shade. She placed the baby on one of the canoe cushions in its shadow, stepped into the canoe. Never had Maida paddled so carefully or so well. On the other side, she tethered the canoe, lifted the baby out. She had cried all the way across the lake and was still crying fitfully. Somebody may come and break the canoe, Maida surmised swiftly, but I can't wait to put it away. She hurried in the direction of the little house. What a surprise I've got for them, her thoughts ran. She was toiling along slowly now, for by this time the baby had grown heavy as lead. Maida had to stop many times to rest her arms. Her back ached as though it would break. They'll all want to keep this baby forever, and I wish we could. But the surprise was not all for the others, nor indeed much as compared with their surprise for Maida. For as Maida neared the house, Rosie came flying down the path. Maida saw that her face was white and that great tears were pouring down her cheeks. "Oh, Maida," she sobbed, "where have you been? We've been looking for you everywhere. A most terrible thing has happened. Poor Mrs. Dorr." She burst for an instant into uncontrollable sobbing, then composed herself. "Fell down the cellar stairs and broke her leg. We've had a dreadful time. Where did you get that baby?" "In a cave," Maida answered faintly. "Will you carry her, Rosie? I'm so tired. Go on, quickly. Tell me all about it." Rosie took the baby into her expert arms, continued. "Well, Arthur called up the Scituate doctor, and he came with an ambulance, and they've taken her to the Scituate Center Hospital. Granny Flynn had to go with her, and we're all alone. We'll have to run the house ourselves until Granny can get back. Poor Dickie feels dreadful, and now we've got this baby on our hands. Everything happens at once, doesn't it? Gracious, I'll have to give this poor little thing something to eat right off. That's a hungry cry." Sweet dreams, my friend. Sleep well.